The following presentation will provide a brief overview of the School Readiness Contract. Please visit the provider portal to view the complete contents of your School Readiness Contract. The Early Learning Coalition of Broward County administers the School Readiness Program through direct child care services. Services are delivered through a comprehensive network of contracted, legally operating child care providers throughout Broward, as well as in neighboring counties, including licensed child care programs, licensed family child care homes, school-age programs, and license-exempt programs. Eligible families have the opportunity to access affordable quality care, allowing them to work and contribute to the community, knowing their children are safe and well cared for. School readiness customers are determined eligible by state and local guidelines. Eligibility may be determined by referrals from other agencies, income, family size, work, or school activities. A program must be legally operating to participate in school readiness. To apply for program participation, a provider will complete and electronically sign the statewide school readiness contract and appropriate provider responsibilities form through the new provider portal. Prior to completing a contract, each provider must complete their profile. The profile will require additional documentation to be uploaded, for example, child care license, liability insurance, and accreditation certificates. The purpose of the School Readiness Contract is to inform the parties of the requirements of participation in the School Readiness Program. Parties identified in the contract are the ELC of Broward County and the provider, who must provide the employer identification number or social security number for identification, payment, and tax purposes. The contract term begins on July 1st or on the date the last party signs the contract and ends on June 30th. A new contract must be executed each year before June 30th to continue providing school readiness services. The contract is not transferable or assignable to another entity, so if a provider sells their business, the new owner must complete a new school readiness contract. The provider must be one of the provider types identified in Section 1002.88 of the Florida statutes. The provider, including the owner, officer, or board director, must not have been convicted of, found guilty of, or pled guilty or no contest to public assistance fraud within the last 5 years. The provider, including the owner, officer, or board director, must not be on the USCA National Disqualified List. The provider must have a pre-contractual inspection conducted by the local licensing agency to ensure compliance with health and safety standards and checklists established pursuant to Rule 6M-4.620 of the Florida Administrative Code to be eligible to deliver school readiness services. Federal legislation now requires that all school readiness providers have an annual health and safety inspection. This inspection will be part of one of the inspections conducted by child care licensing. School readiness standards are more stringent than Broward County licensing standards in several ways, including pre-service training requirements and group size. Complete information and resources regarding the school readiness health and safety requirements can be found at the website listed below. Coming soon, all school readiness programs will be required to complete a program assessment. Most school readiness providers will be required to have the class assessment and will receive a composite score based on that assessment. Some providers may be exempt based on the percentage of school readiness enrollments in their program. All school readiness providers are required to register before the end of December so the education team can schedule the required assessments. School readiness contracts for 2019-20 will only be initiated for providers who have registered for the assessment. School readiness providers must agree to enroll school readiness children only with written authorization from the Early Learning Coalition. The provider will not be reimbursed for services provided beyond the child's begin and end date noted on the authorization. The provider will offer age-appropriate instruction and activities in accordance with the Florida Early Learning Standards. The provider must implement a curriculum approved by Florida's Office of Early Learning for all ages served. And the provider must implement a character development program to develop basic values. The provider is responsible for conducting developmental screenings for school readiness children ages 6 weeks to kindergarten. Initial screenings are to be conducted within 45 days of the child's enrollment. Best practice is for families to be included in administering the screening. Consider having the families complete the initial screening as part of their initial enrollment paperwork packet. If you must complete the ASQ without the family's participation, results will be most accurate once you know the child better. Make sure to complete the screening within the 45 days, but wait until closer to the end of this period. It's important to note that the 45 days starts on the child's enrollment date, whether or not they begin attending right away. Annual screenings are to be conducted during the month of the child's birthday. Results of ASQs are to be entered into the Blue Jean portal, previously known as the old provider portal. You should receive an email reminder of upcoming and overdue ASQs, and your dashboard page on the Blue Jean portal will alert you to upcoming and overdue ASQs. Provider relations staff review the overdue ASQs on a monthly basis and will issue notices of noncompliance for overdue ASQs. Failure to complete ASQs may result in withheld reimbursement, and repeated occurrences of noncompliance may affect your school readiness contract. New this year, parents must sign the ASQ results letter, and copies are to be kept on file by the provider and presented to the ELC upon request. ASQ training is available for all providers and can be done at your center. Please contact the inclusion team to schedule training for your staff. The inclusion team will follow up with you regarding children who score in the area of concern on the ASQ, and they will be happy to provide technical assistance to your staff. Warm line services are available to assist you with any child in your program who is exhibiting challenging behaviors, not just school readiness children. You can contact the Warm Line by calling 954-736-4308. Discipline must not be associated with food, rest, or toileting. Children may not be denied active play as a consequence of misbehavior. Spanking or any other form of physical punishment is prohibited. Workers' compensation must be obtained and maintained as required by law. Reemployment compensation must be obtained and maintained as required by law. Please note this is a separate document from workers' comp. A daily record of attendance, sign-in and sign-out sheets, must be maintained to accurately document attendance and absences. The provider agrees to report to the ELC if a child is absent for 5 consecutive days with no contact. When a child of any age referred for protective services for the school readiness program has an unexcused absence or 7 consecutive days of excused absences, the provider must notify the ELC by noon on the day of the child's first unexcused absence or the day of the child's 7th consecutive excused absence. Children that fall under this reporting requirement will have a yes in the RW column on your enrollment page in the provider portal. A form for reporting the absence of these children can be found on the home page of the ELC's website. The provider agrees to afford authorized parents unlimited access to their children while in care. The provider agrees to provide information to facilitate direct deposit or make alternate arrangements for reimbursement. The Coalition will notify providers of training and technical assistance opportunities. The coalition will determine the eligibility of children enrolling in the school readiness program, and the coalition will monitor the providers for compliance with this contract in accordance with 1002.85 of the Florida statutes or in response to a parental complaint. The provider agrees to allow the Office of Early Learning, the coalition, or its subcontractors immediate access to the facility during normal business hours. The provider agrees to allow coalition staff or subcontractors, the Department of Children and Families or local licensing, the Office of Early Learning, or the United States Department of Health and Human Services to inspect and copy records pertaining to the school readiness program during normal business hours. Records stored off-site shall be provided within 72 hours. Providers agree to protect the confidentiality of child and family information. The provider agrees to have all staff complete confidentiality agreements, and these shall be provided to the coalition upon request. The provider agrees to maintain sign-in and sign-out sheets, enrollment and attendance certificates, documentation to support excused absences, and proof of parent copayment for children funded by the School Readiness Program for a period of 5 years from the last reimbursement request. All the above-named documents must be transferred to the coalition by the last day of business if the provider closes or ceases to offer the School Readiness Program. The provider agrees to provide documentation of its published private child care rates as stated in Exhibit 3. This document will be uploaded along with the provider profile. The provider agrees to accept the lesser of the coalition's maximum reimbursement rate or the provider's published private child care rate. The provider will receive the Gold Seal rate for all care levels for which they have received a Gold Seal designation only if documentation of such has been provided. The provider must provide the parent with a list of any fees it charges and, if applicable, written notice of the difference between the private pay rate and the school readiness reimbursement rate prior to enrollment. The provider is prohibited from charging any fees other than the parent copayment and those fees provided on the list described above. The provider agrees to report any changes in its published child care rates or Gold Seal status in writing through the provider portal as soon as the change has occurred. The provider will receive a special needs rate identified in Exhibit 3 if they have applied and been approved for the special needs rate for a child with a documented special need. The provider agrees that it will notify the coalition if it receives military subsidy payments through Child Care Aware of America on behalf of any child enrolled in the School Readiness Program. The provider's reimbursement rate may be changed as a result of this additional subsidy. The provider shall collect the assessed parent copayment and must give the parent a receipt and retain receipt records. Assessed parent copayments are automatically deducted from the provider's monthly reimbursement. The provider agrees to submit attendance monthly by the 3rd business day of the month, and the provider agrees to review the reimbursement summary provided and report any discrepancies, overpayment, or underpayment within 60 calendar days. Disallowed costs may be deducted from any future reimbursement. The provider agrees to return to the coalition any funds received as a result of error, overpayment, or disallowed costs. If the provider ceases to offer the School Readiness Program before the payment is fully recovered, the provider agrees to return the funds it was overpaid. If the provider fails to return the funds it was overpaid, the provider shall be subject to collection efforts and/or funds may be obtained from other early learning programs. The coalition may temporarily withhold reimbursement or disallow all or part of reimbursement or terminate the contract if the provider fails to provide the minimum services required by the contract. A corrective action notice may be issued by the coalition if it determines that the provider has failed to comply with the terms of the contract. The notice will identify the specific requirements not met, will provide a detailed description of any required corrective action, and will set a deadline for completion. If the provider does not complete a corrective action plan within the prescribed time frame, has multiple corrective action plans within a contract year, or has more than one corrective action plan for the same issue, they may be placed on probation for up to 6 months. The provider agrees to successfully complete previous corrective action or terms of probation due to noncompliance determinations from a prior contract as applicable for the duration of this contract. Probation may include training or staff development, monitoring, or technical assistance by the coalition. The coalition must notify the provider in writing of the terms and duration of the probation. A provider's contract may be terminated for cause if the health, safety, and welfare of children are threatened, if the provider fails to comply with the terms of the contract, if there is a reasonable or probable cause for coalition to suspect that fraud has been committed. Termination of contract for cause may lead to revocation of eligibility to provide school readiness services for a period of up to 5 years. The provider and coalition may agree to terminate the contract by mutual consent, or provider may choose to unilaterally terminate the contract at will. Written notice shall be made at least 30 calendar days before the termination. If sufficient notice is not provided, the coalition may refuse to issue the final reimbursement payment. The coalition may suspend or terminate the provider when it has reasonable cause to believe that fraud has been committed. An investigation may be conducted by the Office of Early Learning and/or the Department of Financial Services. It's important that you notify the Early Learning Coalition of any changes. Changes in contact information or business information should be reported within 14 calendar days. A temporary emergency closing should be reported within 2 calendar days. A permanent closing, change in location or ownership should be reported within 30 calendar days prior to the closing. The provider shall notify the coalition of unusual incidents by close of business the following business day, and shall follow up in writing within 3 business days. Examples of an unusual incident would be an allegation of abuse or neglect against the provider, the injury of a child requiring medical attention, or notice of litigation against a provider. The provider must accept liability for actions of agents, employees, and partners. The provider must maintain child care liability insurance, and the provider is required to provide a certificate of liability insurance that states that the Early Learning Coalition of Broward County is named as an additional insured on the policy. Required liability thresholds are $100,000 per occurrence and $300,000 general aggregate. The contract must be electronically signed by a documented owner or board member, unless an owner or board member provides authorization for another signer on the signature authorization form available on the provider portal. Ownership is verified in most cases by documentation from Sunbiz. Once the school readiness contract is electronically signed by both the provider and the coalition, the status of the SR contract will say certified on the provider portal. The ELC does not direct a family to any particular school readiness provider. Families in need of assistance choosing a provider are referred to 211 for child care resource and referral services. Make sure your program's information is up to date on your profile. You could make any changes to your school readiness program information by updating your profile on the portal. Your provider relations specialist will review the change and let you know if it necessitates a change to your school readiness contract as well. If so, you'll complete a school readiness amendment form. School readiness children enrolled in your program should appear on your enrollment page in the provider portal. Please remember that participation in provider orientation is not a substitute for reading your contract. Please become familiar with the details of your contract as well as the statutes and rules cited within. Thank you.